the imperative was introduced at the American Council Personnel Association conference in Indianapolis. At that time, I had a conversation with several of my doctoral students, and we discussed continuing this conversation and debate because we believed that it was a very significant and historic statement in student affairs. That conversation led to this event, which is designed to foster continuing that conversation and to foster debate over and dialogue over the student learning imperative, which I believe, again, is a very historic event in the history of student affairs. The ideas contained in the document could result in a very dramatic change in the nature of and the structure of student affairs and higher education in this country. We're gathered here in this building and throughout the United States and Canada to discuss whether this is in fact an imperative for student affairs to focus on student learning. And if there is an imperative, how are we as practitioners and preparation program faculty going to adjust our lenses so that we may bring about a focus on student learning, and how that focus will affect the way we carry out our business. You have a series of questions at each individual teleconference site, and I hope that that will stimulate discussion when this teleconference is over, just as we're going to do here, break up into small groups and continue the discussion after the teleconference is completed. Over 125 national and international teleconference sites are tuned in at this moment to this event, which is the first of its kind being telecast from Bowling Green State University's newest building, Olskamp Hall. This building was designed as a state-of-the-art educational programming facility, and we would not, however, be here without the support and the encouragement, I might add, of the American College Personnel Association senior scholars, who have given both financial and moral support for this project. In addition, Bowling Green State University College Student Personnel Program is celebrating its 25th anniversary, as you can see, this year, and is hosting this event. The National Association of Student Personnel Administrators is also cooperating in this venture. I think it's important to note at this point that this teleconference was also supported by the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs, which sponsors the annual Gerald Saddlemeyer Memorial Lecture. My thanks to Vice President Ed Whipple, who is in the audience, and to Deb Vetter, who is also here in the Saddlemeyer Lecture Committee, for helping to make this event possible. I'd also like to take this moment to recognize Miss Mary Saddlemeyer, Jerry's partner, who is with us today. We're pleased that you could join us, Mary. Unfortunately, two of our panelists will not be with us today. Both Dr. Melvin Terrell and Dr. Robert Brown could not be with us. Dr. Terrell was asked by his president to remain on campus this weekend. I don't know what's going on, but those of you who are administrators remember those kinds of things. Bob Brown, I might add, could not be with us. We earlier viewed a videotape of his presentation that he made. His wife was in a very serious accident several weeks ago and is back in intensive care. She was hit by an automobile while riding her bicycle. We do, however, have a wonderful panel of nationally recognized experts, including our speaker for this event, Dr. George Koo, who is professor of higher education in the School of Education and the Graduate School at Indiana University. Dr. Koo is affiliated with the Indiana University Center for Post-Secondary Research and Planning and is director of the College Student Experience Questionnaire Research and Distribution Center. He has authored more than 140 publications and has made over 350 presentations. George has received several awards for his work, including the ACPA Contribution to Knowledge Award. He was also the principal author of the Student Learning Imperative and will be sharing with us today his thoughts on that document. What is student learning? Why now? What does it matter? I present to you Dr. George Koo.
Good morning, And thanks to Don Gehring and to Bowling Green State University and to all the other organizations that are providing an opportunity for me and the rest of us to talk this morning about the student learning imperative. It's a privilege for me, a double privilege really. First, I'm here as the nominal standard bearer of the student learning imperative, the focus of the teleconference. But second, it's a privilege for me to be this year's Gerald Saddlemeyer Lecturer. I want to give you a personal reflection for a moment. This is the 25th year, a great celebration of excellence in student affairs preparation here at Bowling Green. Jerry Saddlemeyer was a good friend of Indiana University, dating back to his relationship with Robert Schaefer, who was Dean of Students at Indiana in the 1950s and 1960s. And when Jerry came from New York, Jerry and Mary came from New York to Bowling Green, further cemented the connections between BG and IU. First it was Bob and Jerry, then Jerry helping me through promotion and tenure with letters that I wrote for him myself. And the connections continue with my good friend Carney Strange, who past chair here of the BG program, where we connected ourselves back at the University of Iowa in the early 1970s, and Mike Coombs on the faculty, one of our stellar former students. These friendships, very important. They add continuity to our lives and our work. A continuity that we can no longer take for granted because higher education is facing an unprecedented combination of challenges that already is dramatically altering what we do and how we do it. The student learning imperatives, we think this is a clarion call to student affairs to take up partnership with the faculty to try to actively shape how our institutions should respond. This morning I'm going to divide this into three chunks. First, I'll talk a little bit about some background to this thing we call the student learning imperative. It's just a document, but we hope it becomes more than that. Then I want to talk a little bit more about the challenges I've just mentioned because I think they're key to understanding why business as usual won't work. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about what I think this means for practitioners, for preparation programs, maybe for research agendas, staff development, professional associations. We'll show a few cartoons along the way. I'll mention a bit about Major League Baseball. Should be something for, even a bit about surfing. So everybody ought to find something to stay in touch with. Most of you, all of you ought to have this student learning imperative in front of you. The sites around the United States and Canada have them. It was mailed out. I'm not going to go through this document, so I suggest if you haven't looked at it, this would be a good time to do so. We have put together the teleconference to stimulate discussion and debate today and beyond. And we can continue this dialogue electronically through the Student Learning Imperative Bulletin Board, which was put up and running by Joe Ucolano at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And his internet address is being flashed to you now, or at some point in the not too distant. Here it is, technology. We're working. I hope you'll also share your reactions directly with the rest of us, and particularly me, about how this set of ideas might influence your work and what we need to do differently. Around this, and in order to try to engage you here as well as elsewhere, I'd like you to be thinking in terms of three questions as we share with you our ideas. First of all, what do I need to do differently with regard to enhancing student learning? Secondly, with whom must I collaborate to create these out-of-class environments that are going to encourage students to take fuller advantage of learning opportunities? And finally, what are the obstacles that we need to address together within the student affairs rainforest and across the river with our faculty colleagues? And I hope you'll share those with us, particularly me, and my address is now being flashed or will be soon. Let me talk now a little bit about this student learning imperative. But I want to start in an obtuse way, of course, and that is with John Irving's new book, A Son of the Circus. This is an author who has very complicated plots, and so I was surprised when he said in a recent interview that this book really had a very simple beginning. Irving could have been quoting from one of the many recent publications about the science of complexity. The science of complexity is the study of the evolution of complex biological and social systems. I mean, people, you, me, our families, the colleges and universities in which we work. Good. That's a cartoon. We're still on. I'm a cartoon. No. But this student learning imperative is also based on a very simple premise. That is, student learning will increase, and so will institutional productivity. Student learning will increase if students invest more time and energy in activities that are compatible with their college's educational purposes. The largest discretionary block of time, of course, is outside the similar, congruent theme for the NASPA meeting in 1996. The substantive discussions leading up to the SLI piece you have before you began in earnest last fall, about 11 months ago at a mountaintop retreat that Charles hosted for us. The group was relatively small. They're listed in the document. You can find their names there. Charles said, if you want to come, you got to write a short paper first. A tremendous, great learning strategy, right? And so we circulated these papers to each other in advance, and so we had a chance to reflect a bit more on our own as well as each other's thinking. We spent 4 days together, a lovely, delightful, challenging 4 days. And upon my return to Bloomington, I attempted to summarize the discussions. That turned into a draft of the student learning imperative, which we revised several times before showing up in Indianapolis last March. That document, very similar to the one you have now, was sent to all the major speakers appearing at that ACPA meeting. The senior scholars got it. In fact, surprisingly, really, all but one of those major speakers wove themes from the student learning imperative into their comments at ACPA. When participants showed up, the 3,300 of them, everybody had one in their document. We held several sessions, 2 sessions at ACPA. The first one on what typically is a real slow Sunday afternoon. And when several people showed up, we were very pleasantly surprised. Of course, I was reminded that on a Sunday afternoon in late March in Indianapolis, what else is there to do? But in any event, the student learning imperative got a pretty favorable response. 3 points of contention emerged, one kind of general sentiment. First, a point of contention. It seemed like our document, kept intentionally short, was silent on the rich history of the student affairs field and its holistic approach to student development. But it's ironic that it was just this belief in holism that led us to conclude that in practice, the field seemed to be overemphasizing psychosocial development and underemphasizing intellectual development. The second concern was related to the definition we put forward of student learning and personal development. The version we distributed in July now says what we intended originally, and that is we simply can't distinguish between learning, personal development, intellectual development, cognitive development. And this point, I think, is best expressed in the bullet. It's the second bullet that is near the bottom of page 1 on the document. The concepts of learning, personal development, and student development are inextricably intertwined. I love that phrase. We actually got it out of the old Nevitt Sanford book, to be honest. They're inseparable. Now, our colleges seem to be organized around academic, learning, cognitive development, the curriculum, and then the student affairs, personal development, affective development stuff. But the dichotomy has almost no relevance to what happens to people when they leave college, where one's job performance, their family life, their participation in community activities, all of these are highly dependent on both cognitive and affective skills. For these reasons, we're considering these concepts, student learning, student development, personal development, to be interchangeable. The third concern I want to briefly mention was How do you add this student learning imperative to an already full plate? Most student affairs divisions seem to be operating at capacity. Relatively few of us are enjoying additional resources. In fact, at most institutions, just the opposite is happening. So it's the how do you do more with less? And I was reminded by a good friend, maybe the question ought to be, how do you do different? The general sentiment, which was assuring to us, and I guess we've struck a responsive chord with so many people around the country being hooked up, the general sentiment was that the time is right for a re-energizing or a redirecting student affairs. It's been since the mid-1970s since we've had a national rallying point, something about which we could come together, debate, and discuss. This could be, they think, the needed impetus. And these periodic re-examinations are necessary, particularly in young, emerging, evolving, applied fields like student affairs. But for me, I think there are some equally compelling reasons why the student learning imperative is important now, and that's what I'm going to turn to here. Why it's timely and maybe even inevitable. Charles Handy is an organizational theorist who dabbles in the study of college and university life. Handy said some months ago, this is a time for thinking the unthinkable and doing the unreasonable. The world beyond the campus is changing. It's changing fast in turbulent, unpredictable ways. The institutions in which you and I work are increasingly vulnerable to these changes, and as a result, the character of American higher education is being modified right before our eyes, and a lot of us don't know it. The obvious reason, of course, the one we throw up our hands about, is the decline in funding. At the federal level, something that we many times overlook even in our business, reductions in federal financial aid mean we've got to use more of our institutional resources to help students. State-assisted institutions have been particularly hard hit by reductions in state funding. In the last decade, the amount of dollars that states provide for higher education have decreased from 19% of state budgets to 14%. At Penn State, the University of Michigan, those institutions are now receiving less than 1/5 of their operating funds from state support. I'm told by Miles Brand, my new president, who was at the University of Oregon, that next year the University of Oregon will receive about 8% of its operating budget from the state of Oregon. Public universities, now it's commonplace for us to describe ourselves as state-assisted, not state-supported. And I'm told that in private conversations, and maybe soon to go public, the president of the University of Michigan will refer to his institution as state-located. Further reductions are inevitable. Some states, more than 85% of their budgets, before they open up budget hearings to education or anybody else, 85% of the budget's already committed through court-ordered spending, entitlements. Other needs are more pressing: building highways, building prisons, maintaining social services. And when there are a few discretionary dollars available for education, it's going to the elementary and secondary schools. Nobody expects these priorities to change. One of our problems is we don't fully appreciate the implications of this. We say, you know, our state, if they really valued higher education, they'd give us more money. And so we look around for other places to go. And we can't find other states that are increasing their support of higher ed. It's the way things are. Simply put, there's not enough money to support all the things that colleges do. So as with Major League Baseball, higher ed simply has become too expensive to operate. Now, state legislatures, they can't give us more money, but they do want to help us. So they're considering bills to determine teaching loads. They're going to help us by mandating reports on student learning. all the regional accrediting associations now want evidence of outcomes of undergraduate education. People want evidence that higher ed makes a difference. At the same time, with all these kinds of pressures, more people than ever before want their children or other members of their family to get a higher education. But they're also clearer and much more vocal about what they want and what they expect for their money. In the vernacular, students want a good job and to be able to live a good life after college. And of course, in our business, we are very familiar with the numbers, increasing numbers, finally, of members of historically underrepresented groups. And this is putting additional strain on us as we try to diversify the curriculum and create more hospitable, affirming campus environments. But the result of all these pressures and more is that institutions are having to reallocate resources. And these reallocations, and this is the key point for us in terms of turning to the student learning imperative, these reallocations of resources are restructuring the way our institutions work. They're redefining the curriculum, they're changing the role of the faculty, and they are surely having an impact on what we do in student affairs. Now, granted, we can step aside for a moment and say this scenario is not going to hold for some colleges, really not much more than a couple of handfuls. The very selective, very affluent liberal arts colleges perhaps won't feel these kinds of pressures, and it may be that 1 or 2 dozen research universities, although I'm less optimistic that changes will not occur there. Now, I should be probably dressed like a chicken. I mean, I sound like Chicken Little. You know, the sky is falling. He's surely overstated the changes that are going to come about. And, of course, only time will tell for sure. But I'm willing to bet a few dollars that we're not overestimating these changes. You know, it's an occupational hazard, it seems, for intellectuals sometimes. We love to back absent-mindedly into the future, you know. I want to remind you of the philosopher who predated Socrates. Thales was his name. And the story goes, he was once so deeply engaged in thinking as he was walking that he fell into a well. Fortunately, we've got a lot of people around the country who help mark wells for us. One of them is Elaine L. Kawas at the American Council on Education. And she does the annual Campus Trends Report. Just released, her 1994 report shows about 60% of institutions say they have already reorganized academic units. More than half have already reorganized student services. About 2/5 say they have eliminated academic programs, although only 7% have terminated faculty. This compares with about 20% of institutions that have reduced student services staff. Now, these percentages differ somewhat by institution. We can take a look at those. Seem to be happening with a little greater frequency at doctoral and research universities. But make no mistake that if you take together the reduction of expenditures, if you take together the reorganization of academic and administrative units, and you add to that terminating or consolidating programs, these things will have an impact on what we're calling core activities. How many classes faculty members teach, how many people who are in those classes, the kinds of research and service institutions will support us to do, and surely what happens in student affairs. Now, a bellwether item for me is the number of institutions that say they are now reviewing the missions of their academic units. 71% say they have already done this, and another 16% expect to do it in the coming year. That's pushing 90%. Unfortunately, no counterpart item on this survey exists for student affairs. So we don't know to what extent the student affairs folks are engaged in similar activities, but rest assured that even though we may not be doing it, somebody in our institution is doing it for us. And we need to know how we might be affected and what the consequences might be. Now, some of you have been around a good bit of time. You're going to say, look here, things are tough right now, but surely we're going to weather this crisis, right? We have to stand firm, you know, stay the course, stick to the knitting, the old Peters and Waterman stuff. You know, it seems like a lifetime ago, but it's less than a dozen years they gave us that advice. Hunker down. Invoke the student personnel point of view, all those good things. You know, we continue to espouse our commitment to holistic student development. The world around us will come to its senses. The approach is familiar. Today, it's irrelevant. It addresses symptoms, not the problem, the turbulent external environment, institution-specific pressures. This is one of the most dynamic moments in the history of American higher education. The clearest implication for us, and this is one that Bruce Johnstone made very plain to us about 10 months ago, we must enhance institutional productivity. Simply put, students need to learn more without the institution spending more. Students need to learn more without the institution spending more. The challenge for us, Student Affairs in partnership with the faculty then, is to try to figure out how can we get students to take greater advantage of the resources that we already have in place. One approach is to make the 50-minute class hour more productive. That's very important. But most of us are gathered today because our classroom goes beyond the classroom. And I want to turn to that now, some implications, perhaps, of student learning outside the classroom. Hawaiians have a saying, never turn your back on the ocean. I guess it's because the ocean is constantly changing. It's unpredictable, and if the ocean catches you off guard, why then we can expect possibly dire consequences. So for me today, looking over my shoulder at a constantly changing ocean suggests that we better learn how to surf. We need to be able to read and to ride, to extend that analogy, the waves of change. We got to be more adaptable. We must be more flexible. We have to adjust and respond and adjust again and respond. Now, whether we can become more flexible and adaptable depends on a lot of things. We got to change our culture. We might even have to take on new roles, new functions, maybe even new clients, but that's for another conversation. The student learning imperative, this is our call to be more intentional about enhancing student learning. Student Affairs ought to be a key player in partnership with the faculty in guiding our institutions toward ways to do this. For me, 3 questions. We have to have answers to 3 questions before we can move forward, and we're going to see those flashed here momentarily. First, what are the out-of-class experiences that contribute to valued outcomes of higher ed? Secondly, what are the institutional conditions under which we can expect these outcomes? And finally, what do we do together? I want to comment very briefly on each. We know a lot about what happens to students outside the classroom. We know when they spend time with faculty outside the classroom on research projects or talking about their academic program, they gain in self-understanding and they learn more in terms of knowledge acquisition. We know that students who use institutional resources like attending the theater and concerts and using the library gain more in a variety of areas compared with the people who don't. We know too, intuitively we've known this for a long time, and now the data are very clear. Peers are critical in terms of student learning. They're the single most important influence, according to Sandy Aston, affecting virtually every aspect of development, cognitive, affective, psychological, behavioral, and lots more data. Ernie Pascarella and Pat Terenzini showed us that cognitive development also has a social or interpersonal base. We know that students who live or are exposed to people who are different develop a greater appreciation and understanding of human differences, and on and on. We have to know this stuff. We have to know it, and we have to be able to articulate it to each other, to faculty, to students. Second, what are these institutional conditions? We know those too. We've known about some of them for a good bit of time, but they're now summarized. If you haven't seen the current revision of Education and Identity, some of us were weaned on that in graduate school, Art Chickering and Linda Reeser, they're summarized there. Our Involving Colleges book, please go buy 2 copies, summarizes them. The Terenzini and Pasquarella monster book. And then Charles Schroeder and Phyllis Mabel have a new book coming out where they're summarized. Again, every one of us needs to know these, and we need to make them accessible to faculty, students, and others. Finally, what can we do together? I've got 3 ideas, and I'm going to short-circuit them here. But first, we've got to take seriously our responsibilities with regard to student learning. Now, this could be hellfire, brimstone, preacher-type stuff. But the fact is that I think too often we have set those ideas aside in the business of getting the work done on a day-to-day basis. We know, for example, that evaluation and feedback are key, and yet most of us are not involved in assessing student learning outside the classroom at all. And without that, what kind of guidance, support, direction do we give to students? Now, student affairs is not solely responsible for what goes on outside the classroom. In fact, I think next to students, peers that is, faculty have far more influence on how students spend their time. When faculty ask students and hold them accountable for studying hard outside the classroom, relatively few students have any other choice. We can do better, and I think student learning will increase when we, along with our faculty colleagues, know what matters to student learning outside the classroom and devote more time and energy to these activities. The second, it's time again to rethink just what it is we're trying to do. This goes back to my earlier point about the ACE data. Virtually everybody else in the institution is doing it, and if we don't think we're going to be restructured into something different than what we are now, that's a mistake. What is it we say we're about, and how close do we come to doing it? And most important, is that the right thing to be doing? Should we be focusing on the academic mission of the institution? Should we be focusing on those aspects of student development that receive little attention in the classroom, right? Identity formation, managing emotions, all that kind of good stuff. Ernie Pasquarella and Pat Terenzini made it very clear we have to do both all the time in every aspect of the institution. Perhaps we can talk more about that. The key task, it seems to me, is to form partnerships with the faculty so we've got our eyes on more tightly coupling what goes on outside the classroom with what goes on inside the classroom. And there's a lesson from Pogo here. We're often our own worst enemies when we insist on using language that we've developed inside the student affairs rainforest, right? So I think in preparation programs and in staff development activities, it's time to teach a foreign language to student affairs professionals. The language of the campus and the language of the disciplines. We've got to become more effective teachers. We've espoused our education function for decades. Now we got to deliver the goods. Pat Cross is the expert on these matters. I'm not going to say much about them. Just a couple of comments. Good teachers make expectations crystal clear. If you haven't seen the NASPA Reasonable Expectations Project document, get a hold of it, because it's a great staff development activity, and we can use it to go beyond the rainforest and to move into academic administration and with our faculty partners. Finally, the single most important thing we can do in terms of our education function, and therefore to enhance student learning, the single most important thing is to get students to think. To get students to think more often about what they're doing in classes and how what they're doing in classes applies to what's going on outside the classroom and in other areas of their lives, and to apply what they're learning. And of course, this goes the other direction as well. This means we've got to spend more time with students, engaged with students, asking them questions, requesting that they interpret for us and for others what they're learning and how that's making a difference to them. So self-reflection, then, this is the key behavior. George Bernard Shaw once said that all progress depends on unreasonable people. Reasonable people, he said, adapt to the environment. Unreasonable people try to shape or modify the environment. In Indianapolis a few months ago, I asked if we could get just 10% of the people who are thinking about these matters to commit themselves to becoming unreasonable people We can change. Community organizers have known this and acted on this principle for a long time. Just 10%, most of us are so apathetic or so overwhelmed with the stuff we have to do that if 10% of us begin to march off in another direction, we can make a difference. So those of us who are going to march along to this unreasonable drumbeat, we've got to believe that student learning outside the classroom is absolutely essential. We've got to establish different expectations for ourselves and for what students do with their time outside of class. We want to change the nature of relations among faculty and students. We long for the day when ACPA and NASPA assert that student learning is their top priority. The unreasonable among us really believe that knowledge is useful, that it makes a difference, you know, to know what Terenzini and his good colleague Ernie Pascarella found in terms of the conditions that promote student learning. And that the stuff that Sandy Aston does on a yearly basis makes a difference in terms of how we might focus the curriculum and challenge students outside the classroom. Of course, we've got our own student development theories and environmental frameworks. The unreasonable among us know that the most pressing need, though, today is for translations of the relevant models from cognitive psychology and learning theory. And the good news is we've got some people working on this stuff. Pat King is here with us today. She's working on a chapter for the next edition of one of our major texts. Marcia Baxter-Magolda, others as well. Finally, the unreasonable among us know we need to know more. We need to know more about how to successfully collaborate with faculty. And we'll hear more about that today, I'm sure. We need to know more about the experiences of new majority students. We need to know more about how students' lives, not just beyond the classroom, but beyond the campus, their jobs, their family. We need to know more about how those things affect their learning and vice versa. I mean, information technologies to connect in class and out of class. I mean, there's a bundle of things we need to know more about, and surely we got to figure out how to redesign what we're currently doing so that we can focus on student learning. I want to conclude, acknowledge again that our emphasis, the student affairs emphasis on holistic student development, I mean, it's one of many reasons that our higher education system in this country is held in high regard around the world. But as Will Rogers once said, it's important to be on the right track, but that's not good enough. You can be on the right track, but unless you're moving, you'll get run over. Student affairs has got to move, and we've got to move quickly if we want to be a major player in the restructuring of American higher education. It is happening now, and we might as well get into the fray. We've got to reconceptualize what we do, how we do it, with an eye on making certain whatever it is we're doing is complementing the evolving missions and purposes of our institution. Now, this doesn't mean we're going to forsake our traditions and our philosophy. I mean, there's nothing passé about holistic learning. But we've got to redefine what these ideals mean in the 21st century. The student learning imperative is an attempt to get us moving in what I hope is the right direction. If 10% of us become unreasonable, we can make a difference to the benefit of students in our institutions. If Jerry Saddlemeyer were here with us today, he was an eminently reasonable man, but on this point, I believe he would join the 10% of us who choose to be unreasonable.
Meyer held professional positions at Wittenberg University and the State University of New York at Geneseo before joining the BGSU faculty in 1969. Jerry served for 16 years as the first chair of the College Student Personnel Program, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. A professional dedicated to offering a program that blended theory and practice, Dr. Sattlemeyer taught, actively published, and participated in professional associations. As those who knew his lighter side are aware, Jerry was also an avid cyclist, racket sports.
Good morning, and welcome to this segment of our teleconference. I'm Charles Schroeder, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at the University of Missouri, Columbia. I'll be serving as the moderator for our panel this morning, and I'd like to introduce you in just a minute to our group of nationally known educators who will share with you, I think, some very interesting, stimulating, and even provocative reactions and perspectives regarding the student learning imperative. Let me start by introducing my colleague, Dr. Lee Upcraft, professor and assistant vice president at Penn State University. Next is Dr. K. Patricia Cross, professor of higher education, University of California at Berkeley. Next, Dr. Elizabeth Nuss, executive director, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. You've met George Koo, and thank you, George, for those great remarks. And finally, Dr. Carol Cartwright, who is president of Kent State University. We have many objectives for this teleconference, but one of them is to certainly make the conference active and engaging for you, our audience. Very shortly, you will be receiving a phone number on the screen, so please don't hesitate to call us. Let's start the conversation with Pat Cross. Pat, what's your take on George's perspective in his speech?
Well, I'd like to try to effect a kind of synthesis of the important message that George gave us with the other two contributions, I think, to the student learning imperative. So I've, in order to make this as succinct and crisp as possible, I've taken kind of three major sentences, one from George's speech, one from the student learning imperative, and then I want to present what I think has been perhaps the most important insight on student learning to come from research in the last 50 years. First, let me say that it seems to me the very heart and the essence of the student learning imperative is contained very well in this single sentence. The key to enhancing learning and personal development is to create conditions that motivate and inspire students to devote time and energy to educationally purposeful activities, both inside and outside the classroom. That seems to me to capture the essence of the student learning imperative and why we're talking about a student learning-oriented student affairs profession. Then George set forth in his interpretation of the student learning imperative, he said in closing, the single most important thing that student affairs staff can do to enhance student learning is to get students to think more often about what they are doing in classes and in other areas of their lives. And then taking those two pieces and incorporating the third piece, which I think is the important insight from student learning research, is that learning is not so much an additive process, with new learning simply piling up on what already exists in our minds, as it is a rather active, dynamic process in which the content in our minds is constantly changing and new connections are being built, and the cognitive structure is being reformatted. So learning consists of making connections. Our job as educators then, seems to me, in the classroom and out, is to try to help students find the connections or the relationships between the variety of information and knowledge and experiences that we are trying to provide for them. Now, some of you know my penchant for using metaphor as a tool for stimulating thinking. And so I'd like to invoke the metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle to highlight some of the issues for today's discussion. College is, as we know, a puzzle to many students. We try to give students the many pieces of that puzzle that constitutes a college education, but then we leave it up to them to put the pieces together. The freshman is faced with something comparable to a 1,000-piece puzzle dumped on the table in front of her. And she's literally overwhelmed by the task, especially when she has no box-top picture to go by. She hasn't thought very much about what this puzzle should look like when it's all put together, and in what way she will look differently. How then, I would ask, do we expect her to know what educationally purposeful activities are? That is, where should she spend her time and her energy? Putting a puzzle together is self-motivating as long as we keep seeing connections and as long as we see progress in building toward a meaningful picture. And so it is with learning. Every puzzle freak knows that the special delight of finding a single piece of the puzzle that puts two larger pieces together, or the satisfaction of finding an especially interesting puzzle piece and seeing where it goes, or turning it round and looking at it from different perspectives to see how it fits into a total picture, and then putting it aside for a while, and then maybe all of a sudden later finding where that goes and wondering why in the world we didn't see that before. So this has been called the aha experience. Aha, I see, I understand, I know where that goes. And that's what we refer to now as deeper learning or as understanding. I would ask us for a moment just to think of how frustrated we would be if we had a partner in putting together a puzzle, and all that partner did was keep dumping more pieces out in front of us. And they never helped us put anything together, never showed us where pieces to go, and yet we as partners with students in the learning process are doing just that, and it starts with orientation. We literally send out students with their baggie, and they go around department to department, and all the departments dump extra pieces of the puzzle in. They don't look to see what's in the student's baggie. They just pour more pieces in. We would be enormously frustrated by trying to get the puzzle together with that kind of help. So the new student learning imperative calls for creating conditions, I remind you again, that motivate and inspire students to devote time and energy to educationally purposeful activities. So if students are to know what's educationally purposeful, they need to be able to know how to visualize those various learning experiences in the context of that larger puzzle. In other words, we need to help them get that box-top picture together. Now, to make a very concrete suggestion out of this synthesis of these three ideas, one useful and realistic role, it seems to me, for student affairs professionals would be to work directly with students throughout their entire college curriculum to reflect and to think about and to visualize what kind of person they want to be, how to put that puzzle together that we call a college education. It seems to me that the university faculty is becoming increasingly sophisticated at what I would call the micro-learning, the small pieces of learning. What's lacking in the college environment altogether is anybody who works on the macro level. And I see student affairs with their kind of consistent and historical application of thinking holistically about the student as one place that's very useful and productive, I would think, for student affairs people to help people reflect on that total picture and therefore to put the pieces of experiences and information together to try to form that puzzle that's the college education.
The puzzle metaphor is certainly intriguing and stimulating. As you suggest, this is certainly the case on my campus. Students, I think, increasingly have a difficult time making connections, particularly between the formal curriculum, how they devote their time to formal academic experiences, and informally, how they devote their time outside of class. Liz, you're interested in this topic. In fact, you've recently written some about making the connections. What do you recommend? Where should we start if we want to pursue some of the recommendations embedded in the student learning imperative?
I think there are a couple of things. Liz Witt and I did a chapter for the book that you mentioned earlier, looking primarily at the residential, but I think there are lots of things that we can extrapolate from ways in which we would talk about connections there to ways in which we would connect between the undergraduate curriculum and the out of class in general. And I think when you hear Pat and George talk about, how do you create those conditions, I think we'd say that there are 3 elements that people ought to keep in mind when we talk about creating conditions. First, there's that need for that clear purpose and expectations, and George talked about that. When a faculty member gives a clear set of instructions and sets high expectations for students, they rise to those expectations. We need to keep that in mind in terms of every expectation that we set for both in the class and out of the class. I think we have to take a careful look at policies, practices, and environments that facilitate and support connections between what takes place in the classroom, in the formal curriculum, and outside the classroom. And I think the third element are people. And I go beyond people with good intentions and good commitments to individuals who have those intentions and have those commitments, but also have a set of skills. I think when I start to think about where to begin, I think there's 5 or 6 things that I'd hit on as to things that I'd think about if I were getting ready to start on this right now. And I'm going to hit the 5 very quickly, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of them a little bit more now. Hopefully we'll come back to some of the others in questions. Certainly the whole area of institutional assessment. Does the institution really know itself? And that comes through in the Involving Colleges and Sandy Aston's literature. How well does the institution really know its strengths and its weaknesses? The need to design programs that are consistent with whatever the unique mission and cultures of that institution. Institutional leadership would be the third. Taking a careful look at physical environments and our facilities and the messages that they send about connections between the curriculum and out-of-class learning in all its formats. And finally, I think some things you need to think about in the area of recognitions and rewards would be a couple of those areas. Let me just talk a little bit about, if I had a vision about what student affairs people would do if I look at that leadership component. I think when I look at leadership, I would look at a commitment of academic and student affairs people, leaders that are committed to achieving student learning and personal development. And it's not enough for one person, the academic affairs person, to be committed to student learning and for the student affairs person to be committed to student development or personal development. You need leaders in academic affairs and student affairs that are committed to both the student learning and the personal development. I think we need leaders and individuals who can foster an understanding among the constituencies. George talks about that pressure that's on higher education. And we need to have people that can be very clear about changing the expectations and helping faculty, trustees, parents, alumni understand what we mean when we say about the importance of those connections. Setting high expectations. A willingness to identify and seek common ground among student affairs professionals and faculty. And we know enough about collaboration and cooperation to know that success is very unlikely if it's going to be on the terms of one or the other group. Collaboration takes people being willing to understand the other side and be willing to make mutual accommodations. I think student affairs staff, one, need to view themselves broadly as educators. They need to become able to demonstrate an interest and a concern for intellectual development. Good practitioners need to be able to suggest courses and extracurricular activities that are congruent with the students' academic goals, which means we have to work more diligently to understand the students' academic goals and to understand those connections ourselves. We need, as student affairs professionals, to understand the goals and the curriculum. And I don't think we spend enough time and attention with new staff orientation and returning staff, helping them understand what the curriculum that the students are going to experience inside the classroom is really like. I think we need to take steps to examine what are the practices or the things that we're doing in our professional practice that either inhibit or promote those connections between the class and out-of-class activities. And I think student affairs professionals have to be able to assess, describe, interpret students in every aspect, whether it's their demographics, their attitudes, their values, their learning styles. But I think we have a very important role to play, not just in assessing and not just in describing, but doing that interpretation for faculty and others to help make those links. If I had to describe what I want from my faculty colleagues, I also have some things that I think have to be done very, very differently. I think first we need to be able to have faculty who consider student affairs professionals as true partners in the academic enterprise. We need faculty members who are knowledgeable about how their courses contribute to the goals of undergraduate education on the campus. I think we have many faculty that can tell us how their course contributes to the knowledge in their discipline or how it fits within their discipline. We need many more who are able to articulate how their course fits into the undergraduate curriculum. We need faculty members that can provide guidance in how to apply the course-related skills that a student is developing and that knowledge to what goes on in a student's daily life. That also means that faculty members have to understand the student's daily life. That's where student affairs people who are good at that assessing and that interpreting make that important bridge and that link. We need more faculty to recognize what the literature and the research is telling us, which is that how the curriculum is delivered is far more important than its content or its structure. The notion that an intellectual community requires our students to share a common intellectual experience, whether it's a common class, a common other experience, where there's more of those opportunities for our students than there are for them individually. I want to talk a little bit about physical environment and facilities because I think they have a tremendous impact on the messages that we send both to our students about connections and to those constituencies, alumni, legislators, trustees. We need to look at our facilities in terms of how well are they designed to facilitate group study, collaborative learning, group projects. Too often we don't have adequate spaces for students to participate in their classroom projects and activities outside the classroom. And it gives a message about how important those connections may or may not be on the campus. I think the whole role of computer technology and what it will provide for students as an opportunity to, one, share common intellectual experiences, comment collectively on the academic exercises of their fellow students, receive feedback from faculty members that's shared among the group of students so collaborative learning can take place in some new formats. I think we also need to pay attention to how we are assigning students to the classes and are they having enough common experiences. So often we hear about a student that has one class with one group of students and never sees those students again. In particular, I think when we look at what we're doing with some of the freshman orientation classes, are there ways in which that group of students can move into some other common intellectual and academic experiences and not just that orientation activity? So those would be a few things I'd start off with now, Charles.
Good, good. I want to remind both our audience here at Bowling Green and our audience in the teleconference to please come forth with some questions. We have our number on the screen, 1-800-590-4624. We're also looking for questions from the audience. And panelists, I've been informed that if you'll talk up just a little bit more, we'll get a slightly better projection of your voice. Liz, you and Pat have suggested both kind of a focus and some ways to proceed. But I'm sure before we jump on this new bandwagon, if you will, there are bound to be some obstacles and constraints that we need to consider. Lee, you've been around a while. You're a seasoned administrator. What's your view on this? So what recommendations would you have for us? What are some realities that we probably ought to be focusing on before we get too enthusiastic about this?
I don't know what seasoned means, but I have a few scars over 30 years. As a practitioner, I have to ask the questions, what will student services and programs look like if the Student Learning Initiative transforms our profession? What will be the implications for graduate programs? And what will be the implications for the delivery of services and programs? My answer is that some of our services and programs will be largely unaffected by the student learning imperative. And I'll name names a little bit later. Those services and programs which have more direct connections to the academic mission of our institutions and can demonstrate that through assessment that these services and programs do in fact contribute to the academic mission of the institution will have greater priority. Likewise, those services and programs with more traditional direct connections to psychosocial development will assume a lesser priority. I see, for example, a change in the title of our Chief Student Affairs Officers. I think they will be more likely to be entitled Vice President for Student and Academic Support Programs and Services. I think there are some basic services that will not be affected. Admissions, financial aid, registrar, discipline, those things that are much less connected to our educational mission. Nobody seems to challenge those 4 areas, except students, of course, when they challenge discipline. I think this means that those services and programs, such as learning support services, career development and placement, academic advising, orientation, living learning residence halls, internships and service learning, leadership development, health education, and support services for underrepresented groups and women will take greater priority. Now comes the hard part. Given a steady state or declining resources, which services inevitably will have a lesser priority? I see personal counseling at the top of my list. I see health services, student activities, and student government all assuming a lesser priority in the way we do things. In short, the student affairs operation of tomorrow in colleges and universities will look very much like the student affairs operations in community colleges today. I think this imperative also has implications for the delivery of services and programs. Here I think because courses for credit can force students to think about and change the way they spend their time outside the classroom, that is the wave of the future in terms of educating students. We already know that freshman seminar courses for credit have a much better impact on the transition to college than orientation programs outside the classroom. We know that career development seminars are more effective. We know that alcohol education courses and courses which educate students on sexuality and nutrition and other health education issues are more effective than out-of-classroom programs. The same can be said for leadership development, internships, and multicultural and gender issues. Finally, I think that this student learning imperative has enormous implications for our graduate preparation programs. And that has been suggested by several of the other of our speakers. But we're going to have to do more to include in our graduate preparation programs learning styles, learning theory, teaching methodologies, curriculum construction, course design, and we got to give our graduate students more opportunity to teach in the classroom as well as outside the classroom. I think this also means that, and I agree with the other panelists, that we have to have a focus on assessment, but our outcomes are going to be less oriented toward psychosocial development and more oriented toward intellectual development, cognitive development, and yes, grades and retention. My final caveat is let's not go too fast. If SLI is the right path, right now, our profession, our student affairs profession, is not prepared. We must be careful not to promise more than we can deliver. We're not yet experts on student learning. We must look before we leap.
Thank you, Lee. You've given us some interesting glimpses into one future. Let's turn now to Carol Cartwright. Carol, you're a student of higher education. You observe national trends and patterns. You're also a university president. As a president, what's your take on the student learning imperative? What are some issues from your vantage point?
Charles, I've been listening to this very rich discussion and very appreciative of George's very excellent presentation. And of course, I've had the opportunity to review the documents as everyone else has had. And the one thing that keeps running through my mind is this wonderful phrase out of Max Dupree's book about leadership, in which he says the first responsibility of leadership is to define reality. And so from a presidential point of view, I think I would really want to begin some comments there by saying that I think what presidents really must do now is to define reality. And it's a reality that, quite frankly, is frightening to many people. George went through a number of the particulars. I certainly don't need to repeat them. But what I do think I need to repeat and affirm, really, is that we are in a period of change that is extraordinarily different from the change periods that we have experienced over the last 50 years. We are at a point in the evolution of higher education in the United States where the underpinnings that we have come to depend on and that we have been refining and honing since the end of the Second World War are in question and are changing. That reality is very difficult for many people within our institutions to accept. Part of a president's role right now, I believe, is to help define that reality in a way that acknowledges the inevitable stress and anxiety, because we've got real people having real commitments to real students and real responsibilities. At the same time, we're trying to look at how we need to change. So I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a stressful time and to acknowledge that it's a time in which the change is occurring very fast, and also to help people understand that the change is not driven just from what we see within our institutions, but really is largely being driven by external events, by external requirements. The university of the next century is likely to be like this university in the overarching goals of the discovery of knowledge and the education of the whole person. But in many other ways, it's going to be dramatically different. Some within our institutions are willing to imagine that new university right now. Most are not. But I can assure you that there are many others outside the walls of our colleges and universities who are imagining that new university. They are the people who fund us. They are the public who wants to hold us accountable. They are the employers who hire our graduates. They are a number of other constituencies, but they are there and they are imagining the new institution. So bringing this kind of reality inside of our institutions and helping various groups that need to begin working on these issues together understand the reality, I think, is a very significant part of today's president's responsibilities. I've come to think of this challenge as the leadership trust and the leadership task. I think the leadership trust is to create an environment in which people believe that if they get involved, they know that something will happen. To use the catchword of the day, to empower them that this is worth paying attention to. And then I think the task is to create the processes and the activities that will lead to some action steps, to some very practical solutions that can be implemented. I don't believe you can get to the task without having the leadership trust established. And I think there are many presidents and chancellors today who are working hard to create that environment, that culture in which it is okay to come forward, to participate, to have ideas. All right. Now, within that responsibility of defining reality and of creating an environment where people can work together to understand that reality and work on solutions within it, I think the clarion call to bring people to the table is the sentence, "We are all in this together." If we could find ways to make that sentence live on our campuses, we would be at work on confronting the barriers that Lee has suggested, understanding what's the picture on the puzzle box that Pat has suggested, following up on ideas that Liz has proposed, and so forth. Who's the we? In terms of what we've already discussed here, the we is the faculty and the student affairs professionals. But from the point of view of a president, the we is everyone else on the campus. And a number of significant groups outside the campus. What is the this? We are all in this together. What is the this? It's the vision. It's the operationalizing of that term, educationally purposeful. We want our students to have success. We want them to be able to go from our institutions with a set of skills and understandings that will help them not just cognitively, but socially and personally as well. But we must come together in different types of institutions to truly define the vision or the this for those institutions. And then I think the word together is one that slides off the tongue so easily, but is so hard to operationalize because we have come in our various specialties to value just that, specialization. And we have built up reward systems within our institutions that acknowledge the specialty rather than the coming together. So as we, writ large, from the point of view of a president, come together to better create a vision of what it means to organize activities within our institutions so that we can be educationally purposeful, we're also going to have to work very hard on thinking about the together, thinking about how we draw on those special talents and how we create something that is greater than the various parts. And if I could just end this piece, I'd like to go back to a metaphor that Pat Cross posed at another meeting maybe 6-8 years ago now, where she talked about our institutions as symphony orchestras and talked about the wonders of each section of the orchestra doing its own thing extraordinarily well, and about how even within those sections you could envision a performance that was truly excellent. You could have the brass quintet. You could have the string quartet. You could have the percussion ensemble, each giving an individual performance, and it could be of great quality. But you can't have the symphony unless you have all the parts working together, focused on the vision that the conductor, and I suppose in this metaphor that's the president or the chancellor, is having on behalf of the piece of music that they're trying to play. That may help us understand what we are all in this together means in the context of trying to create something beautiful. In the case of the symphony orchestra, the music, in the case of our institutions, an environment that allows people to be educationally purposeful.
Thank you, Carol. I want to remind our audience again that we do have a toll-free number to call in on. I'm going to remind this audience again, many of whom I've known for years and I've never seen them this timid or this passive, that I do have the freedom and the responsibility to call if you're sitting passively in my classroom, so I may call on you if I don't get a question in a second. Let's come back to where Carol left us, this notion of educationally purposeful. That is a concept that seems to be embedded throughout the student learning imperative. It seems to be an issue on many of our campuses. Ted Marquesi at our national meeting in Indianapolis kind of gently chided student affairs folks because he said we're goal-free and data-averse. Now, certainly another aspect of the student learning imperative is assessment, that we have to assess regularly, systematically, student progress, who our students are, and we ought to perhaps channel that information to faculty on a regular basis. What's your sense of how we become more educationally purposeful? George, do you have some thoughts on that? How can we sharpen our focus, if you will? What do we need to do?
I thought I'd be saved by the questioners that are now lining up. Just a couple of observations, things that I think we do now, but we don't do in a systematic way. And it's probably related less to being data aversive and more toward not knowing for sure what we're supposed to be doing. That sounds odd, I guess, but it has to do with focusing on the processes of education and learning. Some of the things that Pat was talking about, some things I mentioned earlier, but I mean, for example, and this will sound a lot like in loco parentis maybe, should we not be concerned with the amount of time students spend studying? Is that not a shared task among faculty and student affairs staff and students? Studying is an educational process. It's self-mediated. Students decide when to do it, how much of it they'll do. What's our role in that? If you're working in a residence hall, is it your role just to look in on and make sure the place is quiet? Or is it your role to give feedback, if you will? This is an informal assessment activity. It's not measuring an outcome. In fact, if you talk to the assessment people today, they're looking now for more creative ways of tapping in to the assessment agenda. And that is to focus on the processes, the informal indicators. If we knew how much time students spent studying compared with activities that I would consider to be less purposeful, such as playing games on their computer. Now, granted, learning's a socially mediated activity. Okay, Pat, you got me, Pat Terenzini. But how much time is appropriate? I think we've got a rough sense of how much time is appropriate. How intrusive can we wish to be? Are we prepared to be? Do we know that that's what our institution wishes us to do? Is that something we've decided as a division of student affairs? To call a student on how much time they're spending. You can't force a student to study. Believe me, I got a sophomore in college. I know this. You cannot force them to study. But is that not establishing and reminding students of the expectation? This is just one example of what we are about here. I think that is informal assessment and it's continuous feedback. Somebody should know better, and I think we're part of that group.
Okay, good. We do have a call, and then we're going to take this question right after we take this call. I think it's from Tom Hadley, Cincinnati. Tom, what question do you have?
Good afternoon, Charles. I just wanted to take objection slightly with what Lee Upcraft was sharing in his thoughts about the obstacles in the future looking to parent student learning. I would just like the panel to respond. Why,
Tom, could you speak up just a little bit?
Okay.
We need a little louder voice from you.
Why, in fact, would co-curricular activities, student activities, what we call out-of-classroom learning, be devalued in the future university, as what Lee was sharing? I, in fact, believe that's probably where we in student affairs probably have the most opportunity to be directive, prescriptive, intrusive in helping students learn.
Lee, you want to respond to that, I believe?
Sure. Let me give a very practical answer. Because faculty-controlled budget committees won't fund it. And my own experience there has been that whenever I try to move and defend additional resources or maintain resources for counseling and for student activities, I'm in deep trouble in spite of my eloquent and persuasive and research-based arguments. It's much easier to talk about and defend things that are more directly related to the academic mission. And that's primarily the reason that I'm suggesting that, while important, and I agree with you, the reality is it ain't going to happen.
Liz, do you want to react to that?
The comment I'd make is that I think student activities will probably look different in the future than it does now. I think as we see how students are spending their time with a greater emphasis on community service and service learning, that may become the new student activity, and it is, I think, if we do it correctly with appropriate time for connections in the class, appropriate time for students to reflect on what their experiences have been, to use that as a reflective learning experience. I think student activities will change and they will become more closely related to some of the academic purposes. And I think if we look at how some of our students are spending their time now, I think we see some of those changes happening, and we need to acknowledge that those are student activities and it's not just traditional student government or our more traditional forms that we've had in the past.
Thank you, Tom. We now have a question from the audience.
Hello, my name is Matwan Howard. It appears that the essence of the student learning imperative is, I guess, basically a collaboration between the student affairs staff and the faculty. I guess my question is, how do we encourage or convince the students themselves to expect or demand to learn and think more? You know, just we've been talking a lot about ourselves, but how do we get them to go through this process?
Excellent question. How do we inspire and motivate? Who would like to take that one on? Pat?
Well,
I've been just a little bit distressed at the direction our conversation has taken, because I think that is the crucial point. I think we've got to give up looking at ourselves as giving students education and looking more at students as getting an education. And in order to do that, they need to be motivated to know what it is they're after. For instance, I guess, George, when you mentioned shouldn't we check more on their study time, I would hope that we would so motivate them that they're here, they're paying a lot of money for this education. They ought to kind of know what's ahead of them so that they would know how their study is going to improve them. In other words, I'd like to shift a little bit of the responsibility to getting students to take more, and I think they're ready to. The community service, those kinds of things indicate that we've kind of undersold students on the extent to which they can assume their own responsibility. So my answer to that question would be it's not so much collaboration between student affairs and staff as it is both of us pressing a little bit harder on students to know what they're about and how they get there. Carol? Yeah.
I don't want to argue with the goal, because I think it's the right one, and I think Pat's answer is on target, but I want to go back to my role of defining reality. The students in our institutions today are increasingly less traditional. And we are increasingly seeing from the external world a kind of consumerism, a sense that we ought to look at what our consumers want, and then we ought to be ready to deliver it. Now, that may not be the right model, but that is the reality of what's coming at us from outside the institutions. And if you look at those two variables, what you find is that students want a good parking place and good teaching in the classroom. And students who are increasingly less traditional want to get in, they want to make it matter while they're there, and then they want it to be convenient when they get out. So we're going to need to look within that particular context for a larger and larger share of our students to do the motivating, to do the inspiring, and to think about them as partners together with the faculty and the student affairs staff.
Thank you. Another question.
Hi, I'm Patrick Love from Kent State University, and in my experience, partnerships and collaboration requires a coming together from two different directions. And so I want to address the topic a little bit of preaching to the choir. My students and my professional and student staffs before them have often asked, how do we become partners with faculty? How do we convince them to come and meet us?
Well, let me give a quick reaction to that and then open it to the panelists. My take on this, from spending a great deal of time with faculty on my campus, is that faculty at times, I think, are as concerned and confused as we are about today's students. And one of the things that concerns them is the number of students who invariably do not show up for lecture classes, sometimes 30 to 40%. And these are some of our most outstanding faculty. That may tell us something about the learning process and some of the assumptions students make about what a lecture is and what they're supposed to get from it. I think a lot of our conversation around the student learning imperative is focused on kind of the out-of-class domains of students, but I would suggest that there's fertile ground for student affairs folks to work with faculty around learning processes, learning activities, designing learning environments that include things such as service learning, other kinds of collaborative approaches that include study groups, the way we structure residential environments, a variety of those things. What's your take on some of these opportunities and where they might be headed?
I don't want to challenge Pat, but I think we ought to spend less time on worrying about that and more about getting on with the collaborations. And we're not going to have 100% participation on either side. But I think we know enough about collaboration. We start with the group of faculty and staff who are our natural allies, who have been participating in some of those areas, and we work to build upon that and to strengthen that. And I think, as Matwan said earlier, we use some of our students to help bring about some of those collaborations and allies, because students can be very influential in inviting faculty to participate in new ways. And sometimes they're more responsive to a student request than they might be to a request from one of us. So I'd look at other ways, but I don't spend a lot of time on how many and is it working. I think we know we've got some natural pockets, and we've got to just build on those.
Lee?
I think you can pick your spots. There are certain times and certain situations where faculty are more amenable to our message than others. It's no accident, for example, that at Penn State, 4 of our colleges have freshman seminars, which we have been very an integral part of developing. They're also the 4 colleges that were experiencing the largest enrollment declines. Likewise, those colleges are ripe for picking when it comes to the career development and placement aspects, and courses have been developed in those colleges. So I think we can pick our spots. We can't change the world overnight, but I think when faculty see us as directly connected to their goal and mission, they're going to seek us out.
I think also we might remind ourselves about what's been driving the faculty for so many years. And the reward system has, in fact, been paying off better, at least in many people's minds, for research than it has for some other activities. But those perceptions are changing, and faculty are increasingly more willing to trust, I think, that more forms of scholarship are going to be acknowledged and rewarded, and that there is an opportunity to look at very legitimate applied work, which might in fact be in this area, that would and could and should be rewarded. And more of even the most research-intensive institutions are more focused on undergraduate education these days than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So there are some allies, I think, within the institution that are, to use Lee's phrase, ready to come in and be partners.
That's certainly the case at my institution. Liz, did you want to
Well,
comment?
I was going to say, when you mentioned the notion of the different forms of scholarship, I think when we talk about finding ways of that, again, achieving common ground, is for student affairs to think more carefully about how their work represents the integration scholarship, the application scholarship, and the teaching scholarship, and to evaluate ourselves on how well we're doing in those areas is another way of us moving to really look at some common ground opportunities.
Okay, we do have another call, and then we're going to go to my colleague Stan Carpenter in the audience. We have Lee Broadbank from Cal State Fullerton on the line. Lee, what question do you have? Have we got Lee?
Hello?
Lee,
Yes.
how are you?
Good, thank you.
What question do you have for our panelists?
My question is, how do we measure and justify our impact or contribution to student learning in a system that only counts credit units to graduation as the only measure of student learning?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Now, let's see who rises to the occasion before I point to someone. Anyone like to tackle that one? Liz?
Well, I think one comment is, yes, we keep looking up. Do you notice I'm looking to heaven when I do that? Because that's where the voice came from in the question. I think we look at credit hours, and that's important, but if our work is involved in the enrollment of students and the retention of students on the campus, there's no generation of credit hours unless the students are enrolled and are there partaking in the academic experience. So I think there's a lot of what we do that can be connected in that way, and we ought to look more broadly than just the counting of credit hours. Carol may have some more.
Well, I think that's a really splendid answer, because we are all in this together, and institutions are more and more understanding how integrated some of our processes need to be and accepting the data about what drives retention. And as more, especially public institutions, are enrollment driven, retention becomes increasingly important. And if you can show in a research data documented way that certain activities matter in terms of retaining students, you can be very sure that administrators are going to pay attention to that.
I want to come at this from another way. There are at least 2 questions in that question from Cal State Fullerton. One was, how do we measure, and we've got ways of measuring. The key in the question was whether it warrants our attention at all if the institution isn't going to stand up and take notice. Carol is talking about our conceptions of reality, and she is gently suggesting to us that maybe we haven't got it right. One of the things we know about external influences is that our institutions are changing not because of pressure from within, but because of what's happening from without. On this point, when you ask employers about how well higher ed is doing, they tell us that you're doing great in the major. You know, students know enough about the stuff you teach them. What they don't know enough about is how to think, how to write, how to work in groups, how to get along with people who are different, how to juggle tasks, how to provide leadership.
Hello?
Hello. Is that wrong?
Absolutely.
Well, what I'm suggesting here is that that question is an old way of thinking about it. Granted, that's where the dollars are flowing now, but increasing numbers. Remember, the University of Oregon is not looking so much to the state as much as they are trying to figure out how they're going to get additional resources, right? 8% of their budget. They're listening to business and business and industry wants to know what students can do. And you know who's most interested in what students can do? Students. They want to know they'll be able to do those things when they get out.
Thank you. Before we go to Stan, our engineers have told us there may be a slight problem with our toll-free number, so we're going to provide another number that you can call collect, area code 419-372-0349. Stan Carpenter, Texas A&M University.
I'm going to revisit this faculty question because I think that's the key to the whole ball game, and I'm going to challenge what you've been doing. I'm going to in the sense that one of my old math professors used to tell me when we were being a little unclear on the board when we were trying to prove math theorems, and he accused us of arm-waving our ways through the proofs. It seems to me that we have a cultural, if we look at this from a cultural perspective, as I was taught by reading George's books, we have a dominant culture, the faculty culture, and we have a marginal culture, the student affairs culture. Now, as long as we stay in our place, everything's okay. Now, sort of okay, except then when the resource impingements that you've been talking about begin to get tighter and tighter and tighter, then the dominant culture is obviously going to want to keep what they've got. In the faculty terms, in these terms, it's going to come across like this. First of all, I believe that faculty don't even recognize that there are any puzzle connections. They keep dumping puzzle pieces in your bag because they think that's what they're supposed to do. Student puts them together or doesn't put them together, that's not their problem. I put chemistry pieces in your bag and the next people put math pieces in your bag, and that's my job, is just to put pieces in your bag. I don't care if the puzzle ever gets put together. And I certainly don't see this connection to a personal growth and social growth and so on. That's just not my job as a faculty member, the prototypical faculty member. Secondly, if we do recognize this, we agree to collaborate in any way, there's going to be resource shifts. I like the way the resources are allocated right now. And there's fewer of them, not more of them. So why would I want to cut the pie in a different way if I'm a faculty member? Third, and you alluded to this a little bit, Dr. Cartwright, but the reward structures, at least in the research universities, are not making any progress the right direction. They're, if anything, getting more and more specialized. If anything, demanding more and more grant activity. If anything, demanding more and more publication activity. I don't see Boyer's notions of different kinds of scholarship in the research universities, at least, which are the bellwethers and what everybody else wants to be. They all want to go another level up the food chain. I don't see it happening. And therefore, it's like the 7th grader who makes that long walk across the gym floor to ask the other people to dance. And they hold all the cards, and if they don't choose to dance, then they don't. And why would they? Why would the faculty members dance, George?
Did he ask you to dance?
What kind of music are we playing? If the music is a tune that's familiar to me, I may dance exactly the way you're suggesting, Stan. If I understand the music and I'm confident that I've got the beat and the tempo, it's something I've done before. The faculty members at my institution, most of them are, by and large, kind of the way you've described, but there are fewer of them. My new president is talking about everything that Carol said, understanding everything that you said. And so when we hire a new faculty member, the expectations may be very different than the faculty. It's happening from the bottom up at my institution. We can see it happening with associate instructors and the amount of time we're spending now on teaching strategies with associate instructors. And this is kind of burrowing its way up from the bottom. Now, the reward system hasn't changed yet. What's changing the way we think about our business is not what's going on inside the institution. It's when DuPont comes to us and says, we're willing to fund a research program, but you know what? It's going to be what we want you to do. And since DuPont has got more money than the state does, or than the federal government is willing to give us to do something similar, our ways of thinking are changing a little bit, slowly, and we've got some really interesting cultural cracks opening up. You know, we've got a lot of uncertainty now within the arts and science disciplines as to what knowledge is. There are all sorts of things going on that I think make the music less familiar, Stan. Now, by the way, I don't think we need to dance with faculty to do the thing that Pat was talking about. We don't need to dance with a faculty member to ask a student what sense they're making out of their program of study. Or to go back to my earlier pet peeve, why they aren't studying at all. And it's not making them study, it's just saying, I thought that's why we were here. That's what we're trying to do together. It's, some of us are going to dance, and some of us aren't going to dance, but we're going to change what we do, whether we're dancing together or not.
I'd like to suggest a couple things, Stan. One, I think Carol talked about this or alluded to it, and she may want to comment on it. I think many institutions are certainly trying in an intentional way to recapture the public trust, particularly research universities, where 3/4 or more of the students are undergraduates, where the parents are concerned about high-quality undergraduate education, that there has to be a lot more attention on what we're doing to foster high-quality undergraduate education. I think there is a major role for student affairs in achieving that objective, and I think the SLI is one approach to that. Secondly, I would argue with you. From my contact with faculty, many of whom work at the University of Missouri, I find faculty deeply committed to their disciplines, very concerned about their students, very eager to try and find ways to connect in a more meaningful way with them, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. That may also be a place that we can contribute to focusing on changing student characteristics and how those changes affect the learning process. Carol, do you want to comment as well?
I think there are many people around the country who do see the cracks in the culture and who are ready to move in and try to use them to shape a different kind of reward system and a different kind of faculty culture. I would simply remind us that it took us 50 years to develop this particular culture, this particular kind of reward system in which research is at the top or driving the system. And we're not going to take it apart overnight, even if we are in a period where change is coming at us faster and it's more intense than we're used to. And think about what institutions were like prior to World War II. Faculty did what you do. So we've evolved this culture and this reward system over several decades, and it's not going to be a kind of one-step revolution to the next type of faculty culture. It's going to come at us in incremental ways. I would argue, and I know there are a lot of presidents and provosts around the country, even in the Research One universities, who would argue that unless you have your eye on where you want it to go, you won't be able to direct and shape those small steps toward that larger goal. And I do think they have their eye, as both Charles and George have said, on that larger goal that is more involving, that is more engaged, that is more focused on rebuilding the public trust, and are looking for every single opportunity to move more in that direction.
One comment. It's easy for us to talk about the faculty culture. We rarely talk about our culture. We will have to change our culture too.
Okay, I understand we have 3 calls. The call collect option apparently is working. We've got, it always worked for my children. It continues to work for them now as young adults, so I do get a lot of calls from them to collect. We've got Kathy Wilmack on the phone, I think, from Northwestern State University. Kathy, what question do you have for our panelists?
First of all, I'd like to say we liked Dr. Kuh's analogy of dancing. But we have
Could you speak up just a little bit, Kathy?
Are we being reactive to the accreditation and institutional concern for accountability, or are we remaining proactive?
Did you hear the question?
I think it had something to do with, are we being reactive
or proactive?
Or proactive.
Anyone like to respond to that?
I will jump in and say that I think it's very much both. I don't see an either-or kind of environment. And I'm not sure that's all bad. I do see people, well, for example, with this student learning imperative, here's something that is growing within the profession, but I also see a sensitivity to what's being demanded from outside. And that's probably the right kind of creative tension. I wouldn't be overly concerned.
If we stick it in the context of chaos theory,
It's fine.
it's very difficult to figure out what's cause, what's effect. That's a supportive comment, I think.
Let's take another call, and then we'll get a question from our audience. I understand Kay Goddard from Cal State Long Beach is on the phone. Kay, how are you? What question do you have for the panelist?
Thank you. The students here at Cal State Long Beach were suggesting yesterday that perhaps we are doing too much on behalf of the new majority student. I'd like to connect that with George's comment about self-reflection as a key, and Pat Cross' comment about inspiring students and helping with their connections in learning. What unreasonable suggestions does the panel have for us in assisting students to step up to their responsibility?
Okay, excellent question. Who would like to jump on that one?
Well, I'll defer to others, but hearing no response. I think we have not worked enough. Carol captured it when we talked about working together. That is, everybody needs to have some kind of idea about what we're aiming toward in an educated person. And very few of us think of an educated person as a kind of encyclopedic knowledge. I mean, we think of them as refined, as deeper thinkers, as thoughtful. We have a lot of ideas that our catalogs state beautifully and articulately, but not many of us have incorporated that. I think one of the, and again, to borrow the notion of defining reality for the student affairs people, is one of our natural kind of connections with the campus is with students and with working them toward receiving an education. I still would work toward working with students in conceptualizing an education, and it happens to be true that in history, students have been a very powerful external force on change within the institution. If you look at community colleges, that non-traditional student has brought about major changes in the community college. I think if we worked with students, we would work through students to faculty and to administrators, and in every other way, we would strengthen our own roles while defining a kind of common educated person concept through working through students rather than tackling faculty directly. I think that can be done, but I think it's much harder. And when you talk about, well, let's be realistic, it's easier for student affairs people to work with students on what learning is and on stimulating that than it is to work with faculty who have their own concerns in all of this pressure-packed period.
We have about 5 minutes left before I'm going to introduce our person that will conclude. Let's take this question from the audience, and then we have one person on the line, Ed Stevens, that we'll try and get to. What's your question?
Yes, my name is Robert Calloway, and I'd like to direct this question to Dr. Cartwright. As a college president, you have a lot of responsibilities for the outcome of students. And I would like to know, what is your definition of reality, which you spoke about earlier, and how does your definition impact the outcomes of these students and define your leadership style?
It's a very comprehensive question, and I think one that probably takes another seminar to respond to adequately. I think probably the best way of addressing it is to talk about the fact that really there are many realities. And within a particular institution, I think it is the role of the president to try to bring those realities to the attention of the groups that particular leader is trying to influence. Students certainly represent a very significant part of the realities that institutions have to deal with. And I guess I would argue that we probably have not been as active as we should be and could be in bringing student realities to the attention of the people within the institution that need to deal with them. there's a kind of interpretive function that's important for a president or a chancellor to constantly be tending to. And probably the larger concept that needs to be a part of this conversation is that it's an incredible balancing act. It's an amazing balancing act between a variety of different kinds of realities and different constituents in order to make that whole symphony orchestra work. Maybe you and I can chat a little bit afterwards and get into a little bit more depth about it.
Thank you, Carol. We're going to need to conclude our panel shortly, and before I introduce Pat Terenzini, I want to thank each one of you, Carol Cartwright, George Koo, Liz Nuss, Pat Croft. We are going to take another phone call.
Hello.
You can't imagine. You can't imagine how much fun this is trying to integrate the left ear with the right ear. I understand we do have a call from Ed Stevens. Ed, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Ed, what's your question for our panelists?
From the University of Cincinnati. I have a question for Dr. Cartwright. Dr. Cartwright envisioned the possible operational model of the orchestra where each musician execute his or her piece flawlessly. I would like
Ed,
to
could
challenge...
you talk up some? We're having a hard time hearing you. Could you please talk a little louder?
I would like to challenge that this is a classical model of problem solving. I would like to know, how would the panel encourage a non-classical oriented type of problem solving, more Einsteinian?
Could you hear the question?
No. I'm sorry, I can't.
Ed?
Yes. I'll try a little louder. Okay, Dr. Cartwright envisioned a possible operational model of the orchestra where each musician executes his or her piece
in the
flawlessly.
interest of time, and I know that we're
my position is that this is a classical
probably
model.
the best thing to say is that the metaphor doesn't necessarily suggest that every time you play Beethoven's Fifth, it sounds exactly alike. There's plenty of opportunity, even within a very classical model, of interpretation on the part of the leader. And maybe we need more than one metaphor, and jazz is probably the next best one to talk about.
Yeah, that's great, yeah. Yeah, right. Who wants to sit in on this one? It's going to sound real different. Yeah.
Thanks again, panelists. Carol, it's good to have you here, and it's good to see you again as always. George, thanks for a stimulating set of remarks. Liz, it's always good to see you. Pat, thanks for coming all the way from California. I know it was a long trip for you. Lee, thanks for your comments as well. It's my privilege now to introduce our concluding speaker, Dr. Pat Terenzini, who comes to us from Pennsylvania State University, where he's a professor and co-author with Ernie Pasquarella of a very popular book, How College Affects Students. Pat, you're on.
Thank you, Charles. I've heard Moby book called a lot of things, but popular has never been one of them, at least not among our students. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this event, and also to have the opportunity of having the last word. As a parent of 3 teenagers, I'm not accustomed to that role. But in thinking about how things end, I'm also reminded that, and you will remember that at the end of each Looney Tunes cartoon, it's Porky Pig who has the last word. But while we're on the subject of metaphors, I want to begin by thanking Don Gehring and his colleagues for conceiving of the idea of this conference. It started small and has grown enormously. In fact, I think it's clearly an historic event in size, if nothing else. And in thinking about this last night, it occurred to me that probably nowhere ever before have so many people addressed or thought about the same issue at the same time. And there are some 7,000 to 10,000 people out there addressing and thinking about this issue, and I think that really is an historic moment. I also want to take the opportunity to wish a happy 25th anniversary to the Bowling Green College Student Personnel Program, and to all its faculty and students, its alumni, and in many ways all the professional sons and daughters of Jerry Saddlemeyer. Well, I was asked to summarize and synthesize what was said here today, and as I was making notes, it occurred to me that my sheet was beginning to look more and more like a microfiche card. So if I seem to wander a little bit, it's only because that's the way my notes are, but bear with me if you will. A couple of themes, I think, running through the comments that were made, and the first one I want to call attention to is not really, was not made explicitly by anyone, but I think it's worth pointing out that what's happened here today is a lot of professionals, a lot of student personnel, student development professionals coming together in some good faith efforts to re-examine, to redefine, reconsider, to clarify goals and purposes of the student affairs profession. There's abundant evidence of commitment to enhancing the education of our students and to student learning. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the commonalities, the common purposes that we all share, and to remember, as I think has been pointed out, that the Student Learning Initiative is not without historical foundations. In a conversation this morning, Harold Cheatham and John Shue, Dick Capel, Don Kramer, we talked about the ancestry of this idea, that it goes back to the student personnel point of view in 1937, to what W.H. Cowley wrote about, to what Esther Lloyd Jones wrote about, and those of us this morning that had the advantage of hearing Bob Brown know that it goes back at least that far, and actually it goes back probably 60 years rather than just 20. A second theme really seems to me to be that the ground in dispute, if that's the appropriate word, is really one of the degree of emphasis of balance and the importance of having a clear link between what student development professionals do and the academic mission, the balance of the cognitive and the affective, if you will, the intellectual and the affective, the in-class and out-of-class. That in some ways it's been a discussion of the contrast between a professional ideal, I think, and an ideal that the profession has had for 50 or 60 years, and the extent to which we've given that ideal an operational reality. There are a number of issues being raised here, and as we continue to think and talk about the Student Learning Initiative, I think it's going to be important to separate some of these issues and be clear when a particular category of issues is on the table instead of another. There are certainly the most fundamental issues here have been psychological and epistemological. How do students learn? And we do know something about that. There are philosophical issues that have been raised. What's the appropriate role for student affairs? What should students be learning? What are the educational objectives? The kinds of learning that should be pursued by students and by others, and who should pursue each. There were issues of politics or tactics raised, if you will. Why should we do what we do? There's some suggestions that the Student Learning Initiative may represent something of a safeguard in tight financial times, a response to a restructuring that is proceeding with or without us. And there are practical issues on the table as well. How do we go about achieving these goals? And Lee's cautionary note that as a profession we may not yet be ready to proceed with great haste. George raised the question, what should I be doing differently? What should each of us be doing differently? A third theme, I think, has to do with, and this is a personal view, the concept of holism has been used extensively both in the writing and in thinking and in our talking. But I think it's well to think of the concept of holism as really having in some sense two dimensions. The historical subscription of a profession to the idea that students, to holistic development, that students learn in holistic ways, that a change in one dimension of their being or their lives brings about changes in other facets of it as well, that if the metaphor of a spider's web, that if you touch it in one place, the contact ramifies throughout the entire web. But I think it's also important to remember and to help others remember and understand that students not only learn in holistic ways, they are affected holistically, that any particular kind of change, any particular kind of learning is shaped holistically by the environments in which students live. This is becoming increasingly clear in some of the evidence that we're gathering as part of the National Center for Post-Secondary Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, our national study of student learning, in which we're finding quite clear evidence that gains, for example, in critical thinking or in attitudes toward learning are shaped, as we would expect, by what happens to students in the classroom, but also by what happens to students outside the classroom, and indeed the joint effects of those things, that there is a synergy here, that there's a simultaneity about the students' experiences in a lot of different areas having an effect on a single educational outcome. A fourth, and in some ways maybe the most important theme that I've heard, is the need to help students and to encourage students to become what I'll call more conscious learners, to help them understand the nature of the of their own learning process and how their own experiences will affect that learning. Liz, I think, had this was underlying Liz's comments about making expectations clear. What do we expect of our students? And as some of us may remember, that being clear about what we expect of students was one of the three main points of the NIE study group's report on involvement in learning. We focused a lot on involvement and a lot on assessment, but the being clear up front with students about what we expect of them and holding them to higher standards has been overlooked, I think. There was talk about making connections across experiences and helping students make some of those connections, helping them to think about that. But I believe there's also there's a parallel track to that, if you will, with faculty, that faculty also need to rethink. Anyone involved in education needs to rethink what we mean by education, what we mean by learning. To broaden that definition, it is something that goes on outside the classroom as well as in. Some of the implications of other comments that have been made, the redistribution of, Lee suggested there will be a redistribution of activities, programs, and policies, a redistribution of student personnel, or student development specialists' energies, changes in the delivery of programs and services. There was talk of the importance, Carol raised this point, I think, of the development of trust and confidence from faculty. That I would add to that the need for proven competence, that faculty will respect competence, and as long as we can demonstrate that, we can expect I think, cooperation and the kinds of teamwork that has been called here this morning. Well, since the duty of closing a teleconference falls to me and as the final speaker, I want to conclude by thanking the American College Personnel Association and their senior scholars, and particularly Don Gehring, for making the event possible. I also want to thank Bowling Green State University's Department of Higher Education and WBGU for hosting and broadcasting the program. The National Association of Student Personnel Administrators was also a cooperating organization in this venture, and the Gerald Saddlemeyer Memorial